The Lord be with you.
And your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. On that day, as evening drew on, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us cross to the other side." Leaving the crowd, they took Jesus with them in the boat just as he was, and other boats were with him. A violent squall came up, and waves were breaking over the boat, so that it was already filling up. Jesus was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. They woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Quiet, be still." The wind ceased, and there was great calm. Then he asked them, "Why are you terrified? Do you not yet have faith?" They were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, whom even wind and sea obey?" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Happy Father's Day, Father Doug. Thank you. And happy Father's Day, whether you're a father, et cetera, one of those types of fathers, right? There's so many of them to mention. I like that Father Doug led off with, this is U.S. Open weekend. For us golfers, it's a big deal. And that's where I'm going to start my homily today, because so much of my faith life I learned through golf in some way or another. So when I was playing competitive golf, I played 4 years of high school and college. Whenever we had a really big tournament, I hoped for bad weather. I did. The worse, the better. So for an example, our state championship in the state of Illinois was late October, right, in Chicago. The state championship, the first day, it was windy. The second day, it got cold, windy, and then it started to sleet. Now, playing in the sleet is kind of fun if you're hoping for it, right? Now, why? Well, I had this belief that I could overcome anything at that age, right? You know, and so weather was something that affected other people, but I would overcome it, right? So you have this sense of disoriented self-pride that said I trusted in myself, and I would make excuses like other young men who would say, "Oh, it was so hard out there. It was so cold. It was so windy. It was sleeting." And I would say, with such pride, the course was the same for everybody. The conditions were the same for everybody. So now take it to later in life, where you play board games, you play cards, you roll dice, you play Quirkle. And you play games and you think to yourself, well, other people, when they lose, they make excuses. I just didn't get the cards today. Did you ever have one of those games? Or, well, the dice that just rolled a few bad numbers. But if you have the attitude that you can overcome bad hands of cards, you can overcome bad dice rolls, etc., because where do you place your trust? In yourself and in your abilities. And so that's where I grew up. And so you can imagine that when the storms of life kick up, not just games, but serious things, I would just see them as challenges, as opportunities to overcome things, right? And so there's a favorite phrase of mine when I was failing at overcoming, which was, well, I've tried everything else. Maybe I ought to pray. The last resort. Going to Jesus. Because if I can't overcome it, it just must be too big for me. And after all, I don't want to bother Jesus with small matters like my putting or my dice rolls or something, kind of trivial. So then where do you draw that line? When do you begin to ask Jesus to come into your life to overcome the wind and the storm? How big a storm does it have to be? How high the waves? How high does the wind have to get before we call on Jesus? So when we walked in today, we would have put our hands in the baptismal font and blessed ourselves. And as St. Paul says in the reading, Christ is with us. The love of Christ is with us. It's always within us. We always have to remember that Christ is the creator, right, of the sea, as we hear in the first reading from Job. That he sets its boundaries. He closes its doors, and so on. And that he has that power because he created it in the first place. And he can control it. And yet how many times in life do we try so hard not to call on God? Because we want to control it. Because we want to overcome it. And why? Well, because, it's kind of humiliating to ask. It's so much easier to have that pride, that self-pride that's so disoriented. And here's the key. Instead of trusting in Jesus, I choose to trust in myself. So when I'm dealing with golf or games, that's one thing. But when I'm dealing with issues like grave sin, with evil, with death, with the power of the devil, I'm just not big enough to handle those. Thankfully, I came to that realization that I needed God. And I think in the gospel today, St. Mark is wanting us to call on Jesus. Because notice where Jesus is during the storm. He's sleeping. He's not proactive. He's not engaging them. Instead, he's waiting on them to wake him up. He's waiting to be asked. And for us, so many times, as I said, that's difficult because we choose to place faith and trust in ourselves and those God-given talents and abilities rather than calling God himself. So when we call on God, rather than be in the storm with the wind and the waves, what does Jesus allow us to have? He allows us to have peace. Because when we call on him, he can calm those storms. He can rebuke that wind and so on. And he can give us that inner peace because we know that he is with us through that storm while the boat is rocking. And we know that he cares for us and he'll take care of it for us. And even if it's still hard and painful, etc., his presence is what provides that calm. And so we have to call on that all the time. So in closing, there's a wonderful sermon that St. Augustine gave back around 400, 420 or so. And he asks us to think of ourselves as a boat. So think of yourself as a vessel. This vessel is a temple of God, with God present within it. And while we might tap into that, we might ignore it. And we might allow ourselves, in a sense, to be shipwrecked. But instead, he said, what we need to do is we should not let the waves or the wind overwhelm us. He said we must awaken Christ so that we may sail in quiet waters and at last reach our heavenly homeland. So, in closing, when you're young, it's all about you, right? And you can do it all, and you can overcome anything. Until you get to certain things. So let's not wait. Let's not wait till it gets to that point where we have to call on God. Because they may seem small and trivial, but God's asleep. He's asleep, but he's right here. And he's just waiting for us to call on him, whether it be a tiny little matter or a huge one. Because he wants to give us that peace. He wants to give us that calm. He wants to still those waters. He wants to rebuke that wind. And when we go it on our own, out of our own self-pride and out of our own desire to succeed and overcome, let's not get to that point where we say, well, I've tried everything else. Maybe I ought to pray. May God bless us all.